The wind cut through Broken Ridge like a blade, carrying the promise of winter on its edge. Marshal Eli Carver pulled his coat tighter as he guided his horse through the main street, the wooden buildings standing like weathered sentinels against the gray October sky. Behind him, the prisoner wagon creaked and groaned over the frozen ruts, its sole occupant silent as death. Junia Quinn sat with her hands bound, dark hair falling across her face like a curtain. The townspeople had gathered along the boardwalks, their faces hard as the mountains that ringed their settlement. Some spat in the dust as the wagon passed. Others muttered curses under their breath. All of them watched with the hungry eyes of vultures. "Murderer," came a voice from the crowd. "String her up and be done with it." Eli's jaw tightened, but he kept his eyes forward. 20 years wearing a badge had taught him the difference between justice and vengeance, though he wasn't sure the good people of Broken Ridge cared much for such distinctions. They wanted blood for blood, and in their eyes, the young woman in his custody had plenty to give. The wagon wheel hit a particularly deep rut, jolting Junia forward. She caught herself without a sound, straightening with the kind of dignity that came from a lifetime of taking blows. Eli had seen that look before, in the eyes of soldiers who'd lost everything but refused to surrender. It troubled him more than he cared to admit. 3 days earlier, he'd found her in a line shack 40 miles east, kneeling beside the body of Samuel Thornfield. The rancher lay in a pool of his own blood, a kitchen knife buried between his ribs. She hadn't run when Eli kicked down the door, hadn't protested when he put the iron shackles on her wrists. She'd simply looked up at him with those dark eyes and said, "I killed him." But something in her voice had given him pause. No boasting, no madness, just a flat statement of fact, delivered with the weariness of someone who'd finally reached the end of a very long road. The crowd followed them to the jailhouse, a squat building of rough-hewn logs that served as both courthouse and prison for the scattered settlements in these parts. Eli brought the wagon to a stop and climbed down, his boots hitting the frozen ground with a solid thunk. The mob pressed closer, and he could smell their anger, whiskey and sweat, and something darker underneath. "Eli," called out Jacob Morrison, the town's self-appointed spokesman. He was a thin man with pale eyes and the kind of mustache that suggested he took himself very seriously indeed. "We've been talking, and we figure there's no need to wait for the circuit judge. We all know what she done." "That's so?" Eli kept his voice level as he moved to the back of the wagon. "And here I thought we lived under the rule of law, not the rule of the mob." Morrison's face darkened. "Don't get smart with us. Marshal, that woman killed Sam Thornfield in cold blood. He was a good man, a pillar of this community." Eli had known Sam Thornfield for 5 years, and pillar of the community wasn't the phrase he'd have chosen. The rancher had a reputation for being hard on his hired help and harder on his women. But saying as much to this crowd would be like throwing oil on a fire. He unlocked the wagon's tailgate and helped Junia down. Her legs were unsteady after the long ride, but she managed to keep her balance. Up close, he could see the purple bruise that painted the left side of her face, and older marks on her throat that spoke of rough hands. "Inside," he said quietly, and she walked ahead of him toward the jailhouse door. "This ain't right, Eli," Morrison called after them. "Justice delayed is justice denied." Eli paused at the threshold. "Justice delayed is still justice. Jacob, justice rushed is just revenge with fancy clothes." He guided Junia into the building and shut the door behind them, cutting off the angry murmur of the crowd. The jailhouse was simple. His office in front, 2 cells in back, and a small room where he kept supplies. The cells were built for drunks and horse thieves, not for someone facing a murder charge. But they'd have to do. The iron door clanged shut behind Junia with a sound like a coffin closing. She stood in the center of the small space, still as a statue, her eyes taking in the narrow cot, the slop bucket, the single barred window high up on the wall. "Water's in the pitcher," Eli said. "Food comes twice a day. You need the privy. You call out." She nodded once but didn't speak. He studied her face, trying to read the story written there in bruises and shadows. She was young, maybe 25, though hard living had a way of aging a person before their time. Pretty, despite everything. The kind of pretty that caused trouble in places where men outnumbered women 10 to 1. "You want to tell me what really happened out there?" he asked. For a moment, her composure cracked, and he saw something raw and desperate flicker behind her eyes. Then the mask slipped back into place. "I already told you, I killed him." "Why?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke. Outside, he could hear the crowd dispersing, their voices fading as they headed back to their daily concerns. They'd be back, though murder was entertainment in a place where entertainment was scarce. "Does it matter?" she asked finally. "Dead is dead." "It matters to me." She looked at him then. Really looked. As if trying to decide whether he was worth the risk of honesty. Whatever she saw must not have convinced her, because she turned away and sat down on the narrow cot. "I'd like to rest now," she said, "if that's allowed." Eli nodded and walked back to his office, but the conversation stayed with him. There were questions that needed answering, details that didn't fit together the way they should. Sam Thornfield had been a big man, strong as an ox despite his 50-odd years. Junior Quinn couldn't weigh more than 120 pounds soaking wet. How had she managed to put a knife in him? He settled behind his desk and pulled out the bottle of whiskey he kept in the bottom drawer. Not for drinking. He'd learned that lesson the hard way after the war, but for thinking. The amber liquid caught the lamplight as he held it up, and for a moment he was back in Virginia, watching the sun set over Antietam Creek while the wounded cried out in the gathering darkness. That was where he'd learned about justice, in the spaces between what was legal and what was right. Sometimes they aligned. Often, they didn't. Night fell like a curtain across Broken Ridge, and with it came the cold. The temperature had been dropping all week, and the old-timers were predicting a harsh winter. Already, ice was forming on the water barrels, and the wind carried the promise of snow. Eli banked the fire in the office stove and made his evening rounds. The town was quiet except for the sounds drifting from Morrison's saloon, laughter and music, and the occasional curse. Normal sounds for a frontier settlement where tomorrow was never guaranteed. But from the jail cells came another sound entirely, soft and broken and trying hard to stay hidden. The sound of a woman crying in the dark. Eli stopped outside her cell, his hand on the ring of keys at his belt. Protocol said he should leave her alone. Common sense said the same thing, but something deeper, something that remembered what it felt like to be afraid and alone, made him unlock the door. She was curled up on the cot, her back to him, shoulders shaking with the effort of keeping her grief quiet. She'd taken off her boots, and he could see that her stockings had holes in them, that her feet were small and pale in the moonlight from the window. "Miss Quinn?" She went still but didn't turn around. "Please go away." Instead, he stepped into the cell. It was a violation of every rule he'd ever learned about dealing with prisoners. But the rules seemed less important than the sound of her crying. "Are you hurt? Sick?" "I'm nothing," she whispered. "I'm nobody. Just leave me be." He sat down on the floor with his back against the wall, far enough away that she wouldn't feel trapped, close enough that his presence might offer some small comfort. "Nobody's nobody," he said. "Not in my book." She finally turned to face him, and in the pale moonlight he could see that her cheeks were wet with tears. "Why are you being kind to me? Everyone else in this town wants me dead." It was a fair question, and one he wasn't sure he could answer. Maybe it was because she reminded him of the refugees he'd seen during the war, people who'd lost everything but were still fighting to hold on to their humanity. Maybe it was because something in her voice when she confessed to murder had sounded more like confession to a priest than boasting to a lawman. Or maybe it was because he knew what it felt like to be alone in the dark, with nothing but regret for company. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but you're under my protection now. That means something." She studied his face in the dim light. "You're different from other lawmen I've known." "How many have you known?" "Enough." The word carried weight, and stories he suspected he didn't want to hear. They all wanted something, money or She trailed off, but he could fill in the blanks. "I want the truth," he said. "Nothing more, nothing less." She was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was so soft he had to strain to hear it. "The truth is a luxury I can't afford. Marshal, not anymore." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and whistling through the gaps in the logs. Winter was coming to Broken Ridge, and Eli had the feeling it was going to be a long, cold season indeed. The second day brought no mercy. Eli woke to find a crowd gathered outside the jailhouse before dawn, their breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. Jacob Morrison stood at their head, flanked by the town's most prominent citizens: Henry Walsh, the banker, Doc Peterson, and Samuel Thornfield's foreman, a bear of a man named Dutch Kellerman. "Morning, Eli," Morrison called out as the marshal stepped onto the boardwalk. "We've come to discuss the prisoners' accommodations." Eli's hand instinctively moved to rest on his gun belt. "What about them?" "Well, we've been thinking," Walsh interjected, his banker's smile cold as January wind. "Why should honest taxpayers foot the bill for feeding a murderer? Seems like throwing good money after bad." "She needs to eat," Eli said simply. Dutch Kellerman spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "Sam Thornfield ain't eating. Why should his killer get 3 squares a day?" A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Eli could see the hunger in their faces, not for food, but for retribution, in places like Broken Ridge, where life was hard and justice scarce. People sometimes forgot the difference between punishment and cruelty. "Because that's what the law requires," Eli said. "And because I won't have it said that a prisoner starved under my watch." Morrison's pale eyes narrowed. "The law's a fine thing when it serves justice, Marshal, but when it protects the guilty at the expense of the innocent," he shrugged. "Well, a man's got to wonder whose side you're on." The accusation hung in the cold air like smoke. Eli felt the weight of 20 pairs of eyes on him, measuring his resolve. He'd faced down cattle rustlers and claim jumpers, survived the chaos of war. But something about this moment felt more dangerous than all of those combined. "I'm on the side of doing things right," he said. "Food and water for prisoners isn't negotiable." "Then you can provide it yourself," Walsh said with satisfaction. "The general store's been instructed not to extend credit for prisoner meals, and Mrs. Henderson won't be cooking for murderers." They dispersed after that, leaving Eli alone on the boardwalk with the bitter taste of their ultimatum. He watched them go, noting how they clustered together, whispering and casting glances back at the jailhouse. A plan was forming in their collective mind. He could see it in their body language, hear it in their hushed voices. Inside, Junia sat on her cot, staring at nothing. She hadn't touched the water in the pitcher, and her breakfast, what little he'd managed to scrounge from his own pantry, sat untouched on the floor. "You need to eat," he said. She looked up at him with those dark eyes that seemed to hold too much sorrow for one person to carry. "Why?" "Because you'll need your strength." A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "For what? The gallows?" Eli found himself without an answer. The truth was, her chances weren't good. Circuit judges in these parts tended to see things in black and white, and she'd already confessed to the killing. Even if she changed her story now, who would believe her? A woman with no family, no connections, no one to speak for her character. "Tell me about your family," he said, settling into the chair he'd brought from his office. "Don't have any. Everyone has someone." She was quiet for a long moment, then shook her head. "My PA died when I was 12. Fever took him. Mama remarried quick, had to keep food on the table. New husband didn't take to having another man's child around. Where is she now? Dead. Been 3 years. Her voice was flat, matter-of-fact, as if she was discussing the weather. "Consumption. I'm sorry." She shrugged. "People die. That's what they do." The resignation in her voice troubled him more than tears would have. It spoke of someone who'd learned not to expect kindness from the world, who'd built walls so high that even sympathy couldn't climb them. "How did you end up at Thornfield's place?" For the first time since he'd arrested her, real emotion flickered across her face. Fear, shame, and something else he couldn't quite name. She turned away from him, staring at the small barred window. I needed work. He needed... She stopped, her jaw tightening. He needed someone to cook and clean. That's what the advertisement said, anyway. Eli felt something cold settle in his stomach. But that's not all he wanted. She didn't answer, but her silence was confirmation enough. He'd seen plenty of men like Thornfield during his years as a lawman. Men who used their position and power to take what they wanted from those who couldn't fight back. The law rarely touched such men, especially when their victims were women with no standing in the community. How long were you there? 6 months. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I tried to leave, twice. He found me both times, said I owed him money for room and board, that I couldn't go until I paid it back, but the debt kept growing, and my wages... She shrugged helplessly. Junior. He waited until she looked at him. What happened that night? The truth this time? She was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, the words came out in a rush, as if she couldn't bear to hold them inside any longer. He came to my room, like he had before. I'd learned not to fight. Fighting only made it worse. But that night, something was different. He was angry about something, drinking more than usual. He said things, called me names I won't repeat. And when he was done, he said... She stopped, swallowing hard. He said he was tired of me, that he was going to sell my debt to a man in Cheyenne who ran a house there. Eli's hands clenched into fists. He'd heard of such places, where women were kept against their will, where debt became a chain stronger than iron. The thought of this young woman being condemned to such a fate made his blood run cold. So you fought back. I panicked, grabbed the first thing I could reach, the knife I used for peeling potatoes. I didn't mean to kill him. I just wanted him to stop, to leave me alone. But he kept coming, and I... She buried her face in her hands. I stabbed him. Once, then again when he wouldn't fall. And then he was on the floor, bleeding, and I knew my life was over. The cell fell silent, except for the sound of wind rattling the windows. Eli sat back in his chair, pieces of the puzzle clicking into place in his mind. It wasn't murder. It was self-defense, pure and simple. But proving that to a jury, especially with no witnesses and Thornfield's reputation in the community, would be nearly impossible. Why didn't you run? She looked up at him with eyes that held too much wisdom for her years. Where would I go? I had no money, no horse, no family to take me in. And I knew they'd find me eventually. Men like Thornfield. They have friends, connections. Better to face it here than be hunted like an animal. Eli stood and paced to the small window, looking out at the gray sky. Snow was beginning to fall, just a few flakes. But more was coming. He could feel it in the air, see it in the heavy clouds building over the mountains. I believe you, he said quietly. She stared at him in shock. What? I said I believe you. About Thornfield, about what he did, about why you killed him. Tears began to flow down her cheeks, and for the first time since he'd arrested her, she looked young, vulnerable. You do? I do. He turned back to face her. But believing you and proving it are two different things. The people in this town saw Thornfield as a pillar of the community. They won't want to hear anything that tarnishes his memory. So what happens now? Eli wished he had a good answer for her. The truth was, her situation was desperate. No lawyer would take her case. No witness would speak for her character. The deck was stacked against her in every possible way. Now we wait for the circuit judge. Hope he's a man who believes in listening to all sides of a story. And if he's not, Eli met her eyes, then we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. That evening, as the snow began to fall in earnest, Eli heated a pot of soup on his office stove. It wasn't much, just beans and salt pork with some vegetables from his own garden, but it was hot and filling. He ladled it into a bowl and carried it back to the cells. Junia was sitting on her cot, wrapped in the thin blanket that was all the jail provided. She looked up as he approached, and he could see she'd been crying again. "Thought you might be hungry," he said, sliding the bowl through the bars. She looked at it suspiciously. "The townspeople said they wouldn't feed me. The townspeople don't run this jail. I do." He pulled an old wool coat from under his arm. "And it's getting cold in here. This should help." She stared at the coat as if it were a snake that might bite her. "Why are you being kind to me?" It was the second time she'd asked that question, and he still didn't have a good answer. Maybe it was because she reminded him of someone, his late wife, perhaps, who'd also been small and dark-haired and stronger than she looked. Maybe it was because he'd seen too much cruelty in his life to add to it unnecessarily. Or maybe it was because something in her story rang true in a way that Thornfield's sterling reputation never had. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply. She took the soup but left the coat on the floor. "I won't eat your charity. It's not charity. It's what the law requires, that prisoners be fed and sheltered." "The law?" She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "The law didn't protect me from Thornfield. Why should I trust it now?" Eli had no answer for that either. The law was supposed to protect the innocent and punish the guilty, but like most human institutions, it was imperfect. Sometimes it failed. Sometimes it was twisted to serve the wrong ends. But it was all they had. "Because without it, we're just animals," he said. "And I refuse to believe that's all we are." She looked at him for a long moment, then picked up the spoon and began to eat. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was a start. Outside, the wind howled through the gaps in the buildings, and the snow fell harder. Winter was coming to Broken Ridge with a vengeance. And Eli had the feeling that before it was over, everyone in town would be tested in ways they couldn't imagine, including himself. The blizzard hit Broken Ridge 3 days later with the fury of a wild animal. Snow piled against the windows of the jailhouse until the world outside disappeared into a wall of white. The temperature dropped so low that the water in the pitcher froze solid, and ice crystals formed on the inside of the walls. Eli woke on the 4th morning to find the jail cells uninhabitable. The small stove in the back room had gone out during the night, and no amount of stoking could warm the stone and iron cage enough to sustain life. He found Junia huddled on her cot, lips blue with cold, her whole body shaking uncontrollably. "Come on," he said, unlocking the cell door. "You'll freeze to death back here." She was too cold to protest as he helped her to her feet. Her legs were unsteady, and he had to half carry her to the front office where his larger stove glowed with welcome heat. He settled her in the chair closest to the fire and wrapped his own coat around her shoulders. "I can't," she stammered through chattering teeth. "The townspeople, they'll say—" "The townspeople can go to hell," Eli said bluntly. "I won't have you dying of cold on my watch." He busied himself making coffee, stealing glances at her as she slowly warmed. Color was returning to her face, and the violent shaking had subsided to occasional tremors. She clutched his coat around her like armor, and he noticed how small she looked in the heavy wool. "Better?" he asked, handing her a cup of hot coffee. She nodded, wrapping her hands around the tin cup as if it were precious metal. "Thank you." It was the first time she'd thanked him for anything, and the words caught him off guard. He settled behind his desk with his own coffee, trying to maintain some semblance of professional distance. But it was difficult with her sitting so close to the fire, her dark hair catching the light. The arrangement was temporary, he told himself, just until the weather broke and he could make the jail habitable again. But as the hours passed and the storm showed no signs of letting up, temporary began to feel more permanent. Junia proved to be a quiet presence. She sat by the fire, sipping coffee and watching the flames dance in the grate. Sometimes she helped him with small tasks, mending a torn shirt, organizing papers, always asking permission first, as if afraid he might change his mind about the warmth. On the second evening of the arrangement, as Eli read his Bible by lamplight, he became aware that she was watching him. Not the furtive glances she usually cast his way, but open observation, as if trying to solve a puzzle. "Something on your mind?" he asked without looking up from the pages. You read that every night. Most nights. He closed the book and set it aside. Habit, I suppose. My wife used to read to me from it. It was the first time he'd mentioned Martha to anyone in years. The words slipped out before he could stop them, and he felt the familiar tightness in his chest that always came when he thought of her. What happened to her? Junia asked softly. Eli was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. Cholera. Took her and our boy both. Summer of '68. They were gone within a week. He felt more than saw Junia's sharp intake of breath. When he looked up, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have asked. It's all right. It was a long time ago. But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't entirely true. Some wounds never fully healed. They just learned to ache a little less. How old was your son? 4. Thomas. He had his mother's eyes and my stubborn streak. Eli managed a small smile. Used to follow me around the ranch, asking 100 questions about everything he saw. Why do horses have 4 legs? Pa, why is the sky blue? Where do babies come from? Junia smiled through her tears. He sounds wonderful. He was... Eli picked up the Bible again, running his thumb along its worn cover. After they died, I didn't know what to do with myself. Couldn't stay on the ranch, too many memories. So I took this job. Figured keeping other folks safe might give my life some purpose. They sat in comfortable silence after that. The only sounds the crackling of the fire and the wind howling outside. Eli found himself stealing glances at Junia, noting how the firelight softened the harsh lines that worry and hardship had carved around her eyes. She was beautiful, he realized, in the way that wildflowers growing in rocky soil were beautiful, delicate but resilient, shaped by adversity into something uniquely lovely. The thought troubled him. She was his prisoner, regardless of the circumstances. Letting himself see her as anything else was dangerous territory. But as the days passed and the storm continued to rage, it became harder to maintain that distance. She was always there when he woke, quiet and careful not to intrude, but somehow making the empty office feel less lonely. She mended his shirts without being asked, made coffee when his hands were too stiff from cold, even attempted to cook a decent meal from his meager supplies. You don't have to do these things, he told her one evening as she cleaned up after their supper of beans and hardtack. I want to, she said simply. You've been kind to me, more than kind. It's the least I can do. It's not why I brought you in here. She turned to face him, her dark eyes serious. I know. You brought me in here because you're a good man. Eli Carver. Maybe the first truly good man I've ever known. The use of his first name sent something warm spiraling through his chest. She'd been calling him Marshal since the day he arrested her, maintaining that formal distance even as the walls between them had slowly crumbled. I'm not good, he said. I'm just trying to do right. Same thing, isn't it? Before he could answer, a sound from outside made them both freeze. Voices muffled by the storm, but unmistakably angry. Eli moved to the window and peered through the frost-covered glass. Torches flickered in the swirling snow, and he could make out the shapes of several men making their way down the street toward the jailhouse. Get back, he told Junia, his hand moving instinctively to his gun. Away from the windows. She obeyed without question, retreating to the far corner of the room. The voices outside grew louder, and Eli could make out Jacob Morrison's nasal tone above the wind. We know she's in there. Eli, whole town's talking about it. Eli opened the door just wide enough to step outside, closing it firmly behind him. 6 men stood in his yard, their faces hard and determined despite the brutal cold. Morrison, Walsh, Dutch Kellerman, and 3 others he recognized from the crowd that first day. Evening, gentlemen, Eli said calmly. Bit cold for a social call, don't you think? Cut the pleasantries. Marshal? Morrison snapped. We hear you've got the prisoner living in your office like some kind of guest. That true? The jail's not habitable in this weather. Would you have me let her freeze to death? Might save everyone some trouble, Dutch muttered, earning nods from the others. Walsh stepped forward, his banker's smile nowhere to be seen. This is highly irregular. Eli, people are starting to talk, starting to wonder if you're getting too, attached to the prisoner. The implication hung in the air like a threat. Eli felt his jaw tighten, but kept his voice level. I'm doing my job, keeping a prisoner alive until she can stand trial. Your job is to enforce the law, Morrison said, not coddle murderers. And the law don't require you to move them into your quarters like some kind of boarding house. The law requires that prisoners be housed safely and humanely. That's exactly what I'm doing. Is it? Walsh's pale eyes glittered in the torchlight. Or are you letting other considerations cloud your judgment? Eli's hand moved to rest on his gun butt. I'd be real careful about what you're suggesting. Henry? The banker held up his hands in mock surrender. I'm not suggesting anything, just asking questions that concerned citizens have a right to ask. Well, here's my answer. Eli said, Junia Quinn will remain in protective custody until the circuit judge arrives. Where I house her is my decision, based on practical considerations and the requirements of the law. If you don't like it, you can take it up with the territorial marshal when the weather clears. Dutch spat into the snow. High-handed way to talk to the folks who pay your wages. My wages are paid by the territory, not the town, and my oath is to uphold the law, not to bow to lynch mobs. The word hung between them like a gauntlet thrown down. Morrison's face flushed red despite the cold. Nobody's talking about lynching. We just want proper justice, properly administered. Then you'll get it. When the judge comes. The men muttered among themselves for a moment. Then Morrison stepped forward again. This ain't over, Eli. People have limits to their patience, especially when it comes to coddling killers. Is that a threat, Jacob? It's a fact. Morrison turned and led the group back into the storm. Don't say you weren't warned. Eli waited until their torches disappeared into the swirling snow before going back inside. He found Junia standing by the fire, her face pale but determined. How much of that did you hear? He asked. Enough. She looked at him with something new in her eyes, not just gratitude, but a fierce kind of loyalty. You didn't have to defend me like that. Yes, I did. They're right, though, about people talking. If you keep me here much longer, it'll ruin your reputation. Eli moved to the window and checked the latch, then did the same for the door. The encounter had rattled him more than he cared to admit. Morrison and his cronies were working themselves up to something, and when it came, he wanted to be ready. My reputation can take care of itself, he said finally. What matters is keeping you safe until you can get a fair hearing. And if that's not possible, if the judge decides against me, Eli turned to face her, seeing the fear she was trying so hard to hide. Then we'll deal with that when it happens. But privately, he was beginning to wonder if it would ever get that far. The mood in town was growing uglier by the day, and winter storms had a way of making people desperate. How long before Morrison's patience ran out entirely? How long before good intentions weren't enough to keep the wolves at bay? That night, Eli made a bed for himself on the floor near the door, his rifle within easy reach. Junia had protested, saying she could sleep in the chair, but he'd insisted she take the small cot he kept in the office for long nights. Sometime after midnight, he was awakened by a sound that made his blood run cold, the kind of sobbing that came from the deepest places of the soul. He sat up quietly, peering through the darkness to where Junia lay curled on the cot. She was having a nightmare, her body rigid with terror, small whimpering sounds escaping her lips. Without thinking, he rose and knelt beside the cot, gently shaking her shoulder. Junia, wake up! You're safe! Her eyes snapped open, wild and unfocused. For a moment, she didn't seem to recognize him, and he saw her hand move toward the knife that wasn't there. It's me, he said softly. It's Eli. You're safe. Reality crashed back into her features, and she sat up abruptly, embarrassment replacing fear. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to wake you. Don't apologize. We all have nightmares. She was shaking again, but not from cold this time, without fully considering the wisdom of it. Eli sat on the edge of the cot and pulled her into his arms. She resisted for a moment, then melted against him, her face buried against his shoulder. "I can still feel his hands," she whispered. "Even though he's dead, I can still feel them on me." Eli tightened his arms around her, feeling the fragility of her bones beneath the worn fabric of her dress. "He can't hurt you anymore." "Can't he? Even dead? He's destroying my life. And yours too, probably. My life is my own concern." She pulled back to look at him, her face inches from his in the dim firelight. "You're a good man, Eli Carver. Too good for this world. Maybe." Something passed between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of feelings that neither had dared to name. Eli felt himself leaning closer, drawn by the warmth of her breath, the vulnerability in her eyes. Then sanity reasserted itself, and he pulled back. "You should try to sleep. Morning will come soon enough." But as he settled back onto his bedroll, Eli knew that sleep would elude him for the rest of the night. Something had changed between them, something that went far beyond the relationship between a lawman and his prisoner. And God help them both. He wasn't sure he had the strength to fight it anymore. The storm broke on the 7th day, leaving Broken Ridge buried under 3 feet of snow that sparkled like crushed diamonds in the morning sun. But the peace didn't last long. By noon, the sound of boots stomping on the boardwalk announced visitors, and Eli knew before he opened the door that trouble had arrived. Jacob Morrison stood at the head of a larger crowd this time, nearly 20 men, their face grim with purpose. Behind them, Eli could see more townspeople gathering in the street, women whispering behind their shawls and children peering around their mothers' skirts. "Time for a reckoning, Eli," Morrison announced, his breath forming white puffs in the cold air. "This charade has gone on long enough." Eli stepped outside, closing the door firmly behind him. Through the window, he could see Junia's pale face watching from beside the fire. What charade would that be? "Jacob, don't play dumb with us." Dutch Kellerman pushed forward, his massive frame casting a shadow across the snow. "Whole town knows you've been keeping that woman in your office like she's your wife instead of a prisoner." A murmur of agreement rose from the crowd. Eli could see the righteous anger in their faces, the kind of moral outrage that came from having their sense of propriety offended. In a place like Broken Ridge, appearances mattered as much as truth, sometimes more. "I've been keeping a prisoner from freezing to death," Eli said calmly. "Nothing more, nothing less." Henry Walsh stepped forward, his banker's instincts clearly calculating the political wins. "Be that as it may, Marshal, the situation has become improper. People are talking. Questions are being raised about your fitness for office." "What kind of questions?" Morrison's thin smile was sharp as a blade. "Questions about whether a man who's gotten too close to a prisoner can be trusted to see justice done. Questions about whether you might be willing to let personal feelings interfere with the law." The accusation hung in the cold air like smoke. Eli felt his jaw tighten, but kept his voice level. "My personal feelings don't factor into this case. Junia Quinn will stand trial when the circuit judge arrives, and she'll face whatever verdict the law demands." "Will she?" Dutch's scarred hands flexed at his sides. "Or will she mysteriously escape one night when you're not watching close enough?" The crowd stirred restlessly at his words. Eli could feel their mood shifting, suspicion hardening into certainty. In their minds, he'd already been tried and convicted of dereliction of duty. "That won't happen," Eli said firmly. "How can we be sure?" Walsh demanded. "You've already shown questionable judgment by housing her in your office. What's to stop you from showing more?" "My oath as a lawman, my duty to this community." Morrison laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Your duty was to keep that woman locked up proper, not to play house with her while decent folks freeze in their beds." The crowd pressed closer, and Eli could smell their anger, sharp and hot despite the cold. He let his hand rest casually on his gun butt, not as a threat but as a reminder of the authority he still carried. "The decision stands," he said. "Miss Quinn remains in protective custody until the judge arrives." "When?" Dutch's voice was a growl. "Snow's blocked the passes for weeks. Could be months before any judge gets through." Then we wait months. The hell we do. Morrison's mask of civility finally slipped away entirely. This town has waited long enough for justice. We've got a confessed killer sitting by your fire like an honored guest while Sam Thornfield lies cold in the ground. It's an abomination. Shouts of agreement rose from the crowd. Someone called out, "String her up!" Others took up the cry, and Eli could see the ugly transformation taking place. These were no longer his neighbors and fellow citizens. They were becoming a mob. "Go home," he said, his voice carrying the authority of 20 years as a lawman. "All of you, before someone does something they'll regret. The only thing we'll regret," Walsh said coldly, "is letting this go on as long as we have—" "Stand aside, Eli. Let us do what should have been done days ago." "No." The single word fell like a stone into still water, sending ripples of tension through the crowd. Eli could see hands moving toward weapons, could feel the moment balanced on a knife's edge. "Then you're choosing her over us," Morrison said, "choosing a murderer over the people you swore to protect. I'm choosing the law over the mob. There's a difference." Dutch spat in the snow. "Pretty words, but when it comes down to it, you're harboring a killer because you've gotten sweet on her." The crude accusation sent a wave of anger through Eli so strong it surprised him. His hand tightened on his gun, and for a moment he was tempted to show Dutch just how sweet he could be. But that would only prove their point, that his judgment had been compromised by feelings he was barely willing to admit to himself. "What I've done," he said carefully, "is my job, nothing more." "Your job don't include betting prisoners," Dutch saw, sneered. That was too far. Eli's gun cleared leather in one smooth motion, the barrel coming to rest against Dutch's forehead before the big man could blink. "Say that again," Eli said softly. "Please." The crowd went dead silent. Dutch's eyes were wide with shock, but he had enough sense not to move with 6 inches of gun barrel pressed against his skull. "Easy, Eli," Morrison said nervously. "No need for that. I think there is." Eli's voice was quiet, conversational, which made it all the more dangerous. "Dutch here just accused me of conduct unbecoming an officer. That's a serious charge. Maybe he'd like to make it official? File a complaint with the territorial marshal?" Dutch's face had gone pale beneath his beard. I didn't mean nothing by it." "Didn't you?" Eli pressed the gun harder against the man's forehead. "Because it sounded to me like you were questioning my honor, and I take that real personal." "Eli!" The voice came from behind him, soft and urgent. He turned to see Junia standing in the doorway, her dark eyes wide with concern. "Don't, please." The sight of her, small and vulnerable in the doorway, worry etched across her face, cut through his rage like cold water. He looked back at Dutch, saw the fear in the man's eyes, and slowly holstered his gun. "Get out of here," he said. "All of you, before I decide that disturbing the peace needs to be dealt with more forcefully." The crowd began to disperse, but slowly, reluctantly. Morrison lingered until the others had moved away, then stepped closer to Eli. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "You can't protect her forever. And when the time comes—" He shrugged. "Well, accidents happen, especially to folks who don't know when to stay out of the way." The threat was unmistakable. Eli met the man's pale eyes steadily. "Jacob, if anything happens to that woman while she's under my protection, I'll come looking for you first, and I won't be in a mood for conversation." Morrison's smile was cold as January wind. "We'll see about that." After they were gone, Eli found himself alone with Junia in the office. She was standing by the fire, her arms wrapped around herself as if she were cold despite the warmth. "You shouldn't have done that," she said without looking at him. "Done what?" "Drawn your gun on them. Threatened them. Not for me." Eli moved to the window, watching the last of the crowd disappear down the street. They were out of line. They were right, though, about how this looks, about what people are saying. She turned to face him, and he could see tears in her eyes. "You're ruining yourself for someone who isn't worth it." "Don't say that. It's true. I killed a man. Eli, maybe he deserved it, Maybe he didn't, but I still took a life, and now I'm destroying yours too. Eli crossed the room to stand before her, studying her face in the firelight. You want to know what I think happened that night? She shook her head. It doesn't matter what you think. It does to me. He reached out and gently took her hands in his. I think Sam Thornfield was a man who took what he wanted without asking. I think he hurt you in ways that no man should ever hurt a woman. I think you fought back because you had to, because it was the only choice he left you. You don't know that. Don't I? He squeezed her hands gently. I've seen the marks on your wrists, the way you flinch when someone moves too fast. The nightmares that wake you up screaming. A woman doesn't carry those scars from cooking and cleaning. The tears were flowing freely now, cutting tracks down her cheeks. Even if that's true, it doesn't change anything. He's still dead, and I'm still the one who killed him. Sometimes killing is the only way to survive. I learned that in the war. She looked up at him with something like hope flickering in her dark eyes. You really believe that? I believe you did what you had to do. I believe you're a good woman who has pushed past her limits. And I believe... He paused, knowing that what he said next would change everything between them. I believe I care more about what happens to you than I should. The words hung in the air between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. Junia's eyes searched his face, looking for some sign that he didn't mean it, that it was just pity or duty talking. Eli, she whispered. We can't. You know we can't. I know. But even as he said it, he was pulling her closer. God help me, I know. She didn't resist as he drew her into his arms, didn't pull away when he pressed his lips to her forehead, breathing in the scent of her hair. For a moment, they stood there in the firelight, holding each other like survivors of a shipwreck clinging to the same piece of driftwood. What happens now? She asked against his chest. Eli tightened his arms around her, knowing that whatever came next, there would be no going back to the way things were before. Now we wait for the judge and hope he's a better man than most. But even as he said it, he could feel the storm clouds gathering again. Morrison's threat echoed in his mind, and he knew that time was running out. Soon, very soon, he would have to choose between his duty as a lawman and his feelings for the woman in his arms. And God help them both. He wasn't sure which choice would destroy them faster. Outside, the wind began to pick up again, rattling the windows and whistling through the gaps in the logs. Winter wasn't done with Broken Ridge yet. And neither, Eli suspected, were the good citizens who wanted Junia Quinn to pay for her crimes with her life. The reckoning Morrison had promised was coming, whether Eli was ready for it or not. The attack came 3 days later, in the gray hour before dawn, when honest folks were still abed and only the guilty stirred in the shadows. Eli woke to the sound of splintering wood and angry voices, his hand already reaching for the rifle beside his bedroll. Fire! Fire in the jail! The shout came from outside, but Eli could smell no smoke. His blood turned to ice as he realized the deception. They were trying to draw him out, to separate him from Junia. He rolled to his feet, grabbing his gun belt and rifle in one fluid motion. Junia, wake up, now! She was already stirring, her survival instincts honed by months of living in fear. What's happening? Trouble. The front door shuddered under heavy blows, the sound of axes and sledgehammers echoing through the office. Get dressed, quick as you can. She didn't waste time with questions, pulling on her boots and shawl with practiced efficiency. Through the window, Eli could see torches moving in the street, more than he could count, like angry fireflies in the pre-dawn darkness. The door gave way with a sound like thunder, and Dutch Kellerman burst through with 3 other men behind him. Eli's rifle was trained on them before they could take 2 steps into the room. That's far enough? He said calmly. Dutch's scarred face split in a grin that held no warmth. Morning, Marshal. A fine day for justice, don't you think? Justice is what a judge decides, not what a mob demands. Sometimes a man's got to make his own justice. Dutch gestured to his companions. Rough men that Eli recognized as drifters and troublemakers who'd been hanging around Morrison's saloon. Especially when the law's been corrupted by a pretty face and a sad story. More men poured through the broken doorway, spreading out to flank Eli's position. He counted 8, maybe 10, all armed and looking eager for violence. His rifle could drop 2, maybe 3 before they overwhelmed him. Not good odds. "Where is she?" Morrison's voice came from outside, sharp with impatience. "Bring her out." "She stays where she is," Eli said, not taking his eyes off Dutch. The big man laughed. "You're outnumbered 10-1. Marshal, maybe it's time to be reasonable." Reasonable would have been staying home this morning. Reasonable, said a new voice, would be stepping aside and letting justice take its course. Henry Walsh appeared in the doorway, immaculate despite the early hour. Unlike the others, he carried no weapon, but his pale eyes held a coldness that was somehow more dangerous than Dutch's crude threats. "This isn't justice. Henry, this is revenge. Sometimes they're the same thing." Walsh stepped carefully around the splintered doorframe. "The people of this town have been patient. Eli, more patient than you deserved. But patience has its limits." Behind him, Eli could hear Junia's sharp intake of breath. He didn't dare turn to look at her, but he could feel her fear like a physical presence in the room. "What do you want?" he asked. "You know what we want. The woman. She's confessed to murder, and it's time she faced the consequences. When the circuit judge, there is no judge coming." Walsh's smile was sharp as winter wind. "The passes are blocked solid. Could be spring before anyone gets through. You really think this town's going to wait that long?" Dutch took a step closer, his hand resting on his gun butt. "Time to choose sides. Marshal, you with us or against us?" Eli's finger tightened on the rifle's trigger. "I made my choice when I pinned on this badge." "Wrong answer." The attack came from 3 directions at once. Dutch lunged forward while 2 men rushed Eli from the flanks. He got Dutch center mass with the rifle, the big man crashing to the floor like a felled tree. But the others were on him before he could work the bolt. A gun butt caught him across the temple, sending stars exploding across his vision. He swung the rifle like a club, catching one attacker in the ribs. But hands seized him from behind. His weapons were torn away as more men poured into the office. "Eli!" Junia's scream cut through the chaos like a knife. He fought to reach her, but there were too many of them. Fists and boots rained down on him until the world tilted sideways and darkness crept in around the edges of his vision. The last thing he saw was rough hands seizing Junia, her dark eyes wide with terror as they dragged her toward the door. Then consciousness fled, and he knew no more. He came back to awareness slowly, pain throbbing through his skull like a church bell. His mouth tasted of blood, and every breath sent fire through his ribs. When he tried to move, rope cut into his wrists. "Easy there, Marshal. Don't want you hurting yourself." Walsh's voice, mocking and cold. Eli forced his eyes open, blinking away the blood that had dried on his lashes. He was tied to a chair in what looked like Morrison's saloon, surrounded by the same men who had invaded his office. Through the windows, he could see crowd gathered in the street. "Where is she?" he managed through split lips. "Safe and sound. For now." Walsh poured himself a drink from the bottle on the bar. "Though I can't say how much longer that'll last. Folks are getting impatient." Eli tested his bonds, feeling the rope give slightly. His captors had been careless in their haste. The knots were tight but not professional. Given time, he might be able to work free. "You're making a mistake, Henry." "Am I? Seems to me the only mistake was trusting you to do your job." Walsh sipped his whiskey, savoring both the liquor and his moment of triumph. "But don't worry. We'll handle things from here." "Where is she?" Eli asked again. "Close by. We thought it best to keep her somewhere secure while we discuss the situation." A cold knot of fear formed in Eli's stomach. "What situation?" Morrison stepped out of the shadows, his thin face flushed with excitement. "The situation of what to do with a confessed murderer and the corrupt lawman who tried to protect her. I did my job. Your job was to keep her locked up, not to play house with her like some lovesick fool." Morrison's voice rose with his anger. You think we're blind? Think we didn't see the way you looked at her? The way you defended her? I defended the law. You defended a killer because you wanted to bed her, Morrison spat. Don't pretend otherwise. Half the town saw you mooning over her like a schoolboy. The accusation hit closer to home than Eli cared to admit. Had it been that obvious? Had his growing feelings for Junia been written on his face for everyone to read? Even if that were true, he said carefully, it doesn't change what happened. She killed Thornfield in self-defense. Walsh laughed. Self-defense? Is that what she told you, and you believed her? I know what kind of man Thornfield was. Do you? Morrison's smile was ugly. Sam was a pillar of this community, a good Christian man who gave honest work to folks who needed it, including that murdering whore you're so eager to protect. The word hit Eli like a physical blow. His vision went red around the edges, and he strained against his bonds with such violence that the chair creaked under the stress. Careful there, Marshal, Walsh said, mildly. Wouldn't want you to hurt yourself before the festivities begin. What festivities? Well, we can't just let murder go unpunished. Bad precedent, you understand? So we've decided to hold our own trial, very democratic. Let the people decide what justice looks like. Eli's blood turned to ice. You mean a lynching? I mean justice. Swift, sure, and final. Morrison pulled out his pocket watch. Should be starting any minute now, assuming the guest of honor is cooperative. Through the saloon windows, Eli could see the crowd growing larger. Men, women, even children gathered in the street, their faces bright with the kind of excitement that came from witnessing someone else's destruction. A platform had been erected in the center of town, hastily built but sturdy enough for its grim purpose. You can't do this, Eli said desperately. She's an innocent woman. Innocent? Walsh's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. She confessed to murder. Eli, what part of that sounds innocent to you? She was protecting herself. So she says, but dead men tell no tales, do they? All we have is her word against Sam's reputation. And what about the bruises, the marks on her body? What about the fact that she's a drifter with no family, no connections, no one to vouch for her character? Morrison interrupted. What about the fact that she killed a respected member of this community and then seduced the lawman who was supposed to bring her to justice? The truth of it hit Eli like a sledgehammer. They were right, not about Junia being guilty, but about how it would look to others. A young woman of questionable background, a dead rancher with a sterling reputation, and a marshal who'd let his heart override his judgment. In the court of public opinion, she'd been tried and convicted before the first witness testified. She deserves a fair trial, he said weakly. She'll get one, Walsh assured him. Right here, right now, with her peers as judges. Can't get much fairer than that. A cheer rose from the crowd outside, and Eli's heart sank as he saw them bringing Junia from the building across the street. She walked with her head held high despite the rope around her wrists, her dark eyes scanning the crowd with quiet dignity. When she saw the platform, saw the noose already prepared, she stumbled slightly but quickly recovered, even from a distance. Eli could see the bruise on her cheek where someone had struck her. Rage coursed through him like wildfire, and he tested his bonds again. The rope was loosening, not much, but enough to give him hope. Beautiful, isn't she? Morrison observed, following Eli's gaze. Shame it has to end this way, but you can't say she didn't bring it on herself. Henry, Eli said, turning to the banker. You're an educated man. You know this is wrong. Do I? Or do I know that sometimes a community has to protect itself from those who would do it harm? Walsh finished his drink and set the glass on the bar. Don't worry. Marshal, when this is over, we'll make sure you get a proper burial, side by side with your lady friend, if you like. The casual mention of his own death should have terrified Eli, but all he could think about was Junia standing on that platform, facing death with more courage than most men could muster. She deserved better than this, better than him, better than this town, better than the hand fate had dealt her. But deserving and getting were two different things. as he'd learned long ago. Outside, the crowd's chanting grew louder, and Eli knew that time was running out. Soon, very soon, he would have to make his choice, accept defeat and watch the woman he'd come to love die, or fight back with whatever strength remained to him. The rope around his wrists gave another fraction of an inch, and Eli allowed himself a grim smile. Maybe, just maybe, there was still time for one last desperate play. After all, he'd faced worse odds in the war and lived to tell about it. The only question was whether his luck would hold just a little longer. The rope finally gave way just as the crowd began to chant for blood. Eli's wrists came free with a burning sensation that he barely noticed. His attention focused entirely on the scene unfolding outside. Junia stood on the makeshift platform, her hands bound behind her back, while Jacob Morrison read what passed for charges in this mockery of justice. "Junia Quinn," Morrison's voice carried across the square. "You stand accused of the willful murder of Samuel Thornfield, a respected member of this community. How do you answer, even from the saloon window?" Eli could see the defiance in her posture. She stood straight-backed despite everything, her dark hair whipping in the cold wind. When she spoke, her voice was clear enough to reach even those at the back of the crowd. "I killed him," she said simply, "but not for the reasons you think." A rumble of satisfaction went through the crowd. They had their confession, all they needed to proceed with their version of justice. But Eli knew there was more to her story, more than these people would ever allow her to tell. He worked quickly to free his ankles, keeping one eye on his captors. Most of them had moved to the windows to watch the spectacle outside, leaving only one man, a drifter named Pete Hawkins, to guard him. Pete was more interested in the proceedings outside than his prisoner, a mistake that would cost him dearly. Eli came up from the chair like a striking snake, his arm snaking around Pete's throat before the man could cry out. A brief struggle, a muffled grunt, and Pete went limp. Eli lowered him quietly to the floor, then moved to collect his weapons from the bar where they'd been carelessly left. His gun belt felt familiar and comforting around his waist. The rifle was a reassuring weight in his hands, but even armed, he was still outnumbered 20-1, with half the town between him and Junia. He needed a better plan than charging headlong into the crowd. That's when he remembered the back door. Morrison's saloon connected to the general store next door through a storage room that few people knew about. If he could make it there unseen, he might be able to circle around behind the crowd and create enough confusion to reach Junia. It was a desperate plan with little chance of success, but it was the only chance she had. Moving carefully, Eli made his way to the rear of the saloon. The back door was unlocked. Why would they bother securing it when their prisoner was supposedly tied up helpless? He slipped outside into the alley, the cold air hitting his face like a slap. The crowd's attention was entirely focused on the platform now. Henry Walsh had taken over from Morrison, conducting what he called a trial, but which was nothing more than a formality before murder. Eli could hear fragments of the proceedings as he crept through the shadows. "The defendant has confessed to the crime. Took the life of an innocent man. Clear case for swift justice." Each word was like a nail in Junia's coffin. Eli forced himself to move faster, despite the pain in his ribs and the blood still trickling from his split scalp. Time was running out. He reached the general store and tried the back door. Locked, cursing under his breath. He used his rifle butt to smash the window, wincing at the sound of breaking glass. But the crowd was too worked up to notice one more noise in the chaos. Inside the store, Eli moved quickly through the familiar layout. Canned goods, bolts of cloth, tools and hardware, all the necessities of frontier life. But what he needed was in the back. A case of dynamite that the store kept for miners and railroad crews. His hands shook slightly as he selected 3 sticks, along with fuse and a friction match. He'd used explosives during the war, but that was 20 years and a lifetime ago. Still, some skills never left a man completely. The sound of the crowd grew uglier as he worked, their bloodlust reaching a fever pitch. Through the store's front window, He could see them pressing closer to the platform, hungry for the spectacle of death. Junia stood like a statue in their midst, her face pale but composed. "Any last words?" Walsh called out, his voice carrying false magnanimity. Junia's reply was quiet, but it carried in the still air, "I forgive you all." "God help me, I forgive you." The simple dignity of her words hit Eli like a physical blow. Here was a woman facing death with more grace than her accusers had shown in life. She deserved so much better than this frontier town and its twisted version of justice. She deserved better than him, too, but that was a burden he'd carry for whatever time remained to them both. Moving to the front of the store, Eli positioned himself near the window and lit the fuse on the first stick of dynamite. The hissing sound seemed impossibly loud in the confined space, but outside the crowd was chanting now, drowning out everything else. He threw the dynamite as far as he could toward the edge of the crowd, then immediately lit the second stick. The explosion came just as he hurled it in a different direction, the blast echoing off the wooden buildings like thunder. Chaos erupted in the square. People screamed and ran in all directions, convinced they were under attack. Some dove for cover behind wagons and water troughs. Others simply fled toward their homes, wanting no part of whatever violence was erupting. Eli lit the third stick and threw it at the base of the platform itself. The explosion shattered the makeshift structure, sending boards and debris flying. The noose that had been meant for Junia's neck swung crazily from a broken beam before falling to the ground. In the confusion, Eli saw his chance. He burst from the store with his rifle at the ready, pushing through the panicking crowd toward where Junia had fallen when the platform collapsed. She was on her knees in the debris, dazed but alive, her bound hands making it impossible to protect herself from the falling wood. "Junia!" He reached her just as Morrison appeared through the smoke, his face twisted with rage and his gun already drawn. "You bastard!" Morrison screamed. "You've destroyed everything." His shot went wide as Eli tackled him, both men crashing to the ground in a tangle of limbs and curses. Morrison was smaller, but fought with the desperation of a man whose carefully laid plans were crumbling around him. His fingernails raked across Eli's face, drawing fresh blood. "She's a killer!" Morrison gasped as they struggled. "A murdering whore who seduced you into betraying everything you stood for!" Eli's fist caught him square in the jaw, snapping his head back and ending the stream of venom. Morrison went limp, blood trickling from his split lip. Around them, the chaos was beginning to sort itself out. Men were picking themselves up from the dirt, looking around for someone to blame for the explosions. It wouldn't be long before they realized what had happened and came looking for revenge. Eli cut Junia's bonds with his knife, his hands shaking from adrenaline and fear. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, though he could see cuts and bruises from the falling debris. I thought they were going to..." She couldn't finish the sentence. "They were, but not today." He helped her to her feet, scanning the square for threats. Walsh was nowhere to be seen, probably fled at the first sign of trouble, but other faces in the crowd were hardening again, the initial shock wearing off. "There!" someone shouted. "There's the Marshal and the killer! Stop them!" Eli grabbed Junia's hand and ran, pulling her through the thinning crowd toward the edge of town. Behind them, angry voices were organizing themselves, calling for pursuit. It wouldn't be long before they had horses and dogs and a whole posse on their trail. They reached the outskirts of Broken Ridge just as the first shots rang out behind them. Rifle balls whined overhead. Too high to be dangerous, but close enough to spur them to greater speed. Ahead lay the wilderness, vast, unforgiving, and their only hope of escape. "Where are we going?" Junia gasped as they plunged into the timber. "Away from here, as far and as fast as we can manage. But your job, your life here." "My life is with you now." The words came out before he could stop them, raw and honest. "If you'll have me." She looked at him with eyes that held tears and something else. Something that might have been love if they'd had time to explore it properly. Eli, I know it's not what you planned. God knows it's not what I planned either. But I can't let them hurt you. I won't. Another volley of shots echoed through the trees. Closer this time. Their pursuers were mounted now, gaining ground with every passing minute. The timber was thick here, but it wouldn't hide them for long once the trackers got organized. This way, Eli said, leading her up a steep slope toward the mountains. The going was harder, but it would slow down anyone on horseback. And if they could reach the high country before dark. I can't keep up, Junia panted, stumbling over the rough terrain. Without hesitation, Eli scooped her up in his arms, carrying her like a bride across the threshold of their new life. She protested weakly, but he ignored her, focusing all his energy on putting distance between them and the town that wanted her dead. Behind them. The sounds of pursuit grew fainter as the terrain worked in their favor, but Eli knew it was only a temporary reprieve. Morrison and his allies wouldn't give up easily, not after being humiliated in front of the whole town. They would keep coming, with dogs and guns and the righteous fury of men convinced of their own virtue. But that was tomorrow's problem. Today, Junia was alive and free, and they were together. For now, that would have to be enough. As the sun began to set behind the peaks, painting the snow-covered slopes in shades of gold and crimson, Eli allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, they had a chance after all. Love, he'd learned long ago, was worth fighting for, even when the odds were impossible, even when the whole world stood against you. The old grain warehouse squatted on the edge of Broken Ridge like a forgotten monument to better times. Judge Cornelius Brennan had arrived in town just as the sun painted the mountains blood red, his weathered face grim as he surveyed the destruction in the town square. The broken platform, the scattered debris, the sullen crowd still muttering about justice denied, all of it told a story he'd seen too many times before. Eli and Junia had been captured at dawn, 3 days into their flight through the high country, exhausted, half-frozen, and weakened by hunger. They'd made easy prey for the posse that finally ran them to ground. Now they huddled in the grain warehouse under heavy guard while the town debated their fate. "Quite a mess you've made of things," Judge Brennan said as he entered the makeshift courtroom. He was a tall, spare man with iron-gray hair and eyes that had seen too much of human nature to hold many illusions about it. His black robes seemed out of place in the rough frontier setting, but his presence commanded immediate respect. Morrison stepped forward, his face still bearing the bruises from his fight with Eli. "Your Honor, we're grateful you could come. This situation has gotten completely out of hand, so I see." Brennan's gaze swept over the assembled townspeople, taking in their eager faces and barely contained bloodlust. "I understand there was some attempt at irregular justice while I was delayed by the storm. The people were just trying to see that justice was done," Henry Walsh interjected. "After the Marshal here betrayed his oath and helped a confessed murderer escape." "Did he now?" Brennan's tone was carefully neutral. "And what exactly did this betrayal consist of?" Morrison launched into a heated recounting of events, painting Eli as a corrupt lawman seduced by a wanton woman into abandoning his duty. The crowd murmured their agreement at each damning detail, their righteous anger warming them against the bitter cold. Through it all, Eli sat silent in his shackles, his jaw set in grim resignation. Beside him, Junia stared at the floor, her dark hair hiding her face like a veil. They looked like what they were, two people who had loved unwisely and were now paying the price. "Interesting," Brennan said when Morrison finished. "And what does the defendant say to these charges?" Junia looked up for the first time since the proceedings began. "I killed Samuel Thornfield," she said simply. "Everything else is just noise." A rumble of satisfaction went through the crowd. Here was the confession they'd been waiting for, delivered with the kind of stark honesty they could understand. No pretty words or legal maneuvering, just the brutal truth. "Why did you kill him?" Brennan asked. "Because he was going to sell me to a house in Cheyenne. Because he'd already taken everything else from me. And I couldn't let him take that, too." The courtroom erupted in angry shouts and jeers. Morrison called for order, but the crowd's blood was up again. They wanted their hanging, and they wanted it now. Brennan's gavel, actually a hammer borrowed from the blacksmith, rang out like a gunshot. "Order! I'll have order in this courtroom or I'll clear it entirely." The noise gradually subsided, but the tension remained thick as smoke. These people had come for a show, and they weren't about to be denied by legal niceties. "Miss Quinn," Brennan continued, "you're saying that you killed Mr. Thornfield because he intended to force you into prostitution? I'm saying I killed him because he was going to destroy what was left of my soul, and I couldn't let that happen." Did anyone witness this alleged threat? Junia's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "Who witnesses such things? Your Honor, men like Thornfield don't make their intentions known to the world. They whisper them in the dark, when there's no one to hear but their victims. So, we have only your word for it. Yes, only my word against the memory of a dead man who can't defend himself." Another murmur from the crowd, but this one was different. Some of the faces showed uncertainty now, as if they were beginning to wonder about the story they'd been so eager to believe. "Your Honor," Morrison interrupted, "we can't let wild accusations tarnish the reputation of a good man just because—" "Mr. Morrison." Brennan's voice cut through the protest like a blade. "In my courtroom, the dead don't need defending. The living do. Continue. Miss Quinn." Junia took a shaky breath, then began to speak. She told of her desperate search for work after her mother's death, of answering Thornfield's advertisement for a housekeeper. She spoke of the mounting debt that kept her trapped, of the late-night visits to her room, of the threats and degradation that had worn her down day by day. "He said I belonged to him," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Said he owned me, body and soul, and could do whatever he pleased. And when I tried to leave, he said he'd sell my debt to Madame Carlyle in Cheyenne. Everyone knows what kind of house she runs." The courtroom was deadly quiet now. Even the most ardent supporters of swift justice seemed troubled by the picture she painted. A few women in the crowd were weeping openly, perhaps seeing their own struggles reflected in her story. And on the night in question, Brennan prompted gently. "He came to my room drunk and angry. Angrier than I'd ever seen him. He said things I won't repeat in mixed company. And when he was finished with me, he laughed and said he'd already made the arrangements, that Madame Carlyle would be expecting me the next week." Her voice broke then, the composure she'd maintained throughout the ordeal finally cracking. "I grabbed the kitchen knife and told him to stay away from me, but he kept coming, kept saying I belonged to him, so She shrugged helplessly. "I did what I had to do." The silence that followed was profound. Judge Brennan sat back in his chair, his weathered face thoughtful. In the crowd, people shifted uncomfortably, the righteous certainty of moments before replaced by doubt. "Marshal Carver," Brennan said finally, "what's your assessment of these events?" Eli had been silent throughout Junia's testimony, but now he looked up with eyes that burned with conviction. "I believe every word she said, Your Honor. I've seen the evidence, the bruises, the fear, the way she flinches from sudden movements. That's not the behavior of a cold-blooded killer. That's the behavior of a woman who's been broken down piece by piece until she had nothing left but the will to survive." "Even if that's true," Walsh called out, "it doesn't change the fact that she killed a man. The law is the law." "The law," Brennan said slowly, "recognizes the right of self-defense. The question is whether Miss Quinn's actions fall within that definition." He stood and began pacing the small space in front of his makeshift bench. "Ladies and gentlemen, in my 30 years as a judge, I've seen justice perverted in many ways. I've seen guilty men walk free because they had money and connections. I've seen innocent people hang because they lacked the same advantages." The crowd was listening intently now, caught up in spite of themselves by the old judge's words. "But I've also learned to recognize truth when I hear it, and what I hear in Miss Quinn's testimony has the ring of truth. The uncomfortable, ugly truth that we'd rather not acknowledge, that sometimes our pillars of the community have feet of clay." Morrison's face was flushed with anger. Your Honor, you can't seriously be considering— What I'm considering, Brennan cut him off, is whether justice is best served by hanging a woman who defended herself against a predator, or by acknowledging that sometimes the law must bend to accommodate human frailty. He turned to face the crowd directly. I've heard testimony suggesting that Samuel Thornfield was not the man you believed him to be. I've heard evidence of systematic abuse, of threats and coercion that would drive any reasonable person to desperate measures. And I've seen a community so eager for blood that they were willing to bypass the very legal system they claim to defend. The warehouse was so quiet that the wind outside sounded like thunder. Every eye was fixed on the judge as he prepared to render his verdict. In the matter of the Territory versus Junia Quinn, he said formally, I find the defendant acted in lawful defense of her person and virtue. The killing of Samuel Thornfield, while regrettable, was justified under the circumstances as presented. Case dismissed. The explosion of voices that followed nearly lifted the roof off the old warehouse. Some cheered, others cursed, and a few simply sat in stunned silence. Morrison was on his feet, his face purple with rage, while Walsh looked like he'd swallowed something unpleasant. This is an outrage, Morrison shouted over the din. You can't just let her walk away. I just did, Brennan replied calmly. And as for Marshal Carver, while his methods were unconventional, I find no evidence of criminal wrongdoing. Sometimes a man must choose between the letter of the law and its spirit. In this case, he chose wisely. But even as the judge spoke, Eli could see the ugly mood building in parts of the crowd. Legal vindication was one thing. Acceptance by the community was quite another. Morrison's faction might have lost this battle, but their hatred burned as bright as ever. Your Honor, Eli said, rising to his feet despite his shackles, I'd like to request safe passage out of town for Miss Quinn and myself. I don't think Broken Ridge is going to be a healthy place for us to stay. Brennan nodded grimly. Granted, and I'll make sure you have provisions for the journey. It's the least I can do. As the crowd began to disperse, muttering among themselves about justice denied and corrupt judges, Eli felt Junia's small hand slip into his. Her fingers were cold but steady, and when he looked down at her, she managed a trembling smile. Is it over? She whispered. The legal part is the rest. He squeezed her hand gently. We'll face whatever comes next together. Outside, the wind had picked up again, rattling the warehouse walls and promising another storm. But for the first time in weeks, Eli felt something like hope stirring in his chest. They were free, they were together, and they had a future ahead of them, whatever that might hold. It wasn't the ending he'd expected when he first arrested Junia Quinn in that lonely line shack. But sometimes, he reflected, the best endings were the ones you never saw coming. Sometimes love really could conquer all, even in a place as hard and unforgiving as the frontier. Spring came early to the valley that year, painting the meadows green and filling the air with the sweet scent of wildflowers. The small cabin Eli had built sat nestled against a grove of aspens, their leaves whispering secrets in the mountain breeze. Smoke rose from the stone chimney, carrying with it the smell of fresh bread and the promise of a warm hearth. It had been 6 months since they'd left Broken Ridge behind. 6 months of back-breaking work and simple pleasures. The cabin was modest, 2 rooms and a loft, with a covered porch that faced the sunrise. But it was theirs. More importantly, it was a place where the past couldn't reach them, where they could build something new from the ashes of their former lives. Eli straightened from hoeing the vegetable garden, wiping sweat from his brow as he surveyed their small homestead. The corn was coming up strong, and the beans he'd planted along the fence were already climbing toward the sky. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but it was a good life, an honest life. Water? Junia's voice came from the porch, and he turned to see her approaching with a tin cup and that smile that still made his heart skip like a schoolboy's. Much obliged. He accepted the water gratefully, noting how the sun had brought out golden highlights in her dark hair. She'd put on weight since they'd settled here, the hollow look of hunger and fear replaced by something softer, more peaceful. How's the bread? Rising nicely. Should be ready by supper. She settled beside him on the porch steps, her shoulder brushing against his. It was a simple touch, casual as breathing, but it still sent warmth spreading through his chest. The changes in her went deeper than physical healing. The woman who'd once flinched at sudden movements now laughed freely. The frightened girl who'd expected the worst from every encounter had been replaced by someone who woke each morning with hope in her eyes. "Been thinking," she said, watching a hawk circle overhead, "about what we talked about last week." Eli knew what she meant. They'd been discussing the future, about making their arrangement official in the eyes of God and man. It wasn't a decision to be taken lightly, not with their past still casting long shadows. And I think I'd like to be Mrs. Carver, if you'll have me. The simple words hit him like sunshine after storm. He'd been hoping she'd say yes, but part of him had wondered if the memories of what men could do would always stand between them. "Nothing would make me happier," he said, taking her hand in his. "Though I should warn you, I'm not much of a catch. No badge, no steady income, just a cabin in the middle of nowhere and a man who's seen better days. That man saved my life, more than once." She leaned against him, solid and warm and real. "He gave up everything he'd worked for just to keep me safe. If that's not worth catching, I don't know what is." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the afternoon light paint the mountains gold. Somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed in the valley below, part of the small herd they'd managed to acquire through hard work and careful trading. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough. "Doc Patterson should be through next month," Eli said eventually. "He can marry us proper, if you'd like." "I'd like that very much." That evening, they sat by the fire as had become their custom. Eli read from his worn Bible while Junior worked on a quilt, their quiet conversation punctuated by the pop and hiss of burning logs. It was domestic and peaceful in a way that still sometimes surprised him. After Martha's death, he'd never expected to know such contentment again. "Eli?" Junior's voice was soft, thoughtful. "Do you ever regret it? Giving up your badge for me?" It wasn't the first time she'd asked, and he suspected it wouldn't be the last. The guilt still haunted her sometimes, the belief that she'd destroyed his life through no intention of her own. "Never." He closed the book and looked at her directly. "I spent 20 years trying to serve justice, thinking I knew what that looked like. But real justice isn't about badges or courts or following rules. It's about protecting the innocent and standing up for what's right, even when the whole world tells you you're wrong." "Even when it costs you everything?" "Especially then." He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "Besides, I didn't lose everything. I found something better." She smiled at that, the shadows lifting from her eyes. "What did you find?" A reason to believe that goodness still exists in this world, a future worth fighting for." Later that night, as they lay in their narrow bed with the mountain stars shining through the window, Junior spoke into the darkness. "I used to think I was cursed, that everyone I cared about would be destroyed by knowing me, my father, my mother, even you, for a while. And now I think maybe I was blessed instead. Maybe all that pain was just preparing me for this, for you, for us, for a love that's strong enough to survive anything." Eli pulled her closer, marveling at how perfectly she fit against him. "I love you, Junior Carver." "Has a nice ring to it, don't you think?" Her laugh was soft and musical, the sound of a woman who'd finally found her place in the world. "I love you too, Marshal, even without the badge." Outside, an owl called from the aspens, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote answered. The sounds of the wilderness that surrounded them, wild and free and unburdened by the judgments of civilization. Here, in this valley that the rest of the world had forgotten, they could be who they truly were. The next morning brought visitors, a young couple traveling west with their 2 small children, looking worn and worried. Eli invited them to rest and share breakfast. as was the custom in these remote places where hospitality might mean the difference between life and death. "Mighty kind of you," the man said, accepting coffee with grateful hands. "Haven't seen friendly faces in days." "Heading to California?" Junior asked, already bustling about to feed the children. "Oregon. Got family there, says there's good land for farming." The woman looked exhausted, her dress patched and repatched. "It's been a hard journey," as they shared their simple meal. Eli found himself remembering other travelers, other stories of hope and hardship. The frontier was full of people like this, ordinary folks looking for a fresh start, a chance to build something better for their children. "Ma'am," the youngest child said to Junior, "you got the prettiest smile I ever seen." Junior's cheeks colored pink, but she smiled wider. "Why, thank you kindly. That's about the nicest thing anyone said to me all week." After the family had rested and moved on, laden with supplies from Eli and Junior's modest stores, they returned to their daily routines. But something had changed in Junior's demeanor, a new lightness, as if the child's innocent compliment had lifted some invisible weight from her shoulders. "That little one reminded me of your Thomas," she said as they worked together in the garden. Eli paused in his weeding, surprised by the mention of his lost son. They rarely spoke of their separate griefs, though both carried them like old wounds that ached in certain weather. How so? The way he looked at the world, like everything was possible, like there was good to be found in every person he met. She knelt beside him in the dirt, her hands gentle among the tender plants. Do you think we might have children of our own someday?" The question caught him off guard, though perhaps it shouldn't have. They were building a life together, and children were a natural part of such dreams. But at his age, with his past, "I'd like that," he said simply, "though I'm not a young man anymore. You're not an old one either, and any child would be lucky to have you as a father." That evening, as the sun painted the western peaks in shades of rose and gold, they stood together on their porch and looked out over their small domain. The cabin was solid and warm behind them. The garden showed the first green promises of a good harvest. The cattle grazed peacefully in the meadow below. It wasn't much by the standards of the world they'd left behind, but it was theirs, built with their own hands and watered with their own sweat. Most importantly, it was a place where love could grow without fear, where two damaged souls could heal and become whole. "Junior," Eli said, taking her hand as they watched the first stars appear in the darkening sky, "I need you to know something." "What's that?" "I thought I knew what justice looked like when I wore that badge. I thought it was about law and order, about punishment fitting the crime, but I was wrong." He squeezed her fingers gently. "Real justice isn't about punishment. It's about redemption. It's about second chances and the courage to love despite everything that tries to tear us apart." She turned to face him, her dark eyes reflecting the starlight. "You gave me that chance. Eli, you saw something worth saving when everyone else saw only a killer. I saw a woman fighting for her life, fighting for her soul. That's not something to be punished. It's something to be honored." As the night deepened around them and the mountain silence settled over their valley, Eli reflected on the strange twists of fate that had brought them together. A murder, a trial, a flight through the wilderness. None of it had been planned or expected, but from chaos and violence had come something beautiful and pure. Love, he'd learned, was the most powerful force in the world, stronger than law, stronger than prejudice, stronger than the fear and hatred that drove men to terrible acts. It could transform the guilty into the innocent, the broken into the whole, the lost into the found, and sometimes, if you were very lucky, it could give you a second chance at happiness when you thought all chances were gone forever. For the first time in years, Eli Carver looked to the future with hope instead of resignation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new sorrows, but whatever came, they would face it together, and that made all the difference in the world. Thank you for listening to this tale of love, justice, and redemption in the Wild West. If you're enjoying these campfire stories from the frontier, we'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below and let us know where you're listening from, whether you're by your own campfire under the stars, in a cozy cabin somewhere, or just dreaming of the open range from your city home. Don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Campfire for more stories of courage, love, and adventure from America's frontier days. Share your thoughts about Eli and Junia's journey, and let us know what other tales from the Old West you'd like to hear around our campfire.